If you've ever driven through rural Illinois, you know there's something almost unsettling about those vast cornfields at night. The way the stalks rustle in the wind, creating shadows that seem to move with a mind of their own. The endless stretches of darkness broken only by the occasional farmhouse light. But in 1973, in the tiny town of Enfield, Illinois, something emerged from those fields that would challenge everything the locals thought they knew about their quiet corner of the world. You see, this isn't just another small-town monster story. This is about what happens when ordinary people face something so inexplicable, so beyond their normal reality, that it forever changes how they view the world around them. And perhaps most disturbingly, despite multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and official investigations, what actually stalked the fields of Enfield remains a mystery to this day. It's April 25, 1973. Henry McDaniel, a railroad worker and longtime Enfield resident, is settling in for what he expects to be just another quiet evening at home with his wife. The McDaniels live in a modest house on the outskirts of town where the organized grid of residential streets gives way to sprawling farmland. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and the biggest excitement usually comes from high school football games or the annual county fair. But here's the thing. At around 9:30 p.m., the McDaniels' peaceful evening is shattered by an unusual sound. Their children's pet beagle starts barking frantically outside, but this isn't its normal bark. There's something different about it, something that makes the hair on the back of Henry's neck stand up. The dog sounds terrified. Then comes another sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Something is at their front door. Now, if you're like most people, you might hesitate before opening your door to investigate a strange scratching sound in the middle of the night. But remember, this is rural Illinois in the 1970s. People still leave their doors unlocked. They know their neighbors. The worst thing Henry probably expects to find is a raccoon getting into trouble. So Henry McDaniel does what seems perfectly reasonable at the time. He grabs his flashlight, picks up his .22 pistol. Because even trusting rural folks sometimes keep protection handy, and opens the front door. What happens next would become the first documented encounter with what locals would soon call the Enfield monster. Standing there on his front porch, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight, is something that, in Henry's words, had 3 legs on it, a short body, 2 little short arms, and 2 pink eyes as big as flashlights. The creature's gray-colored body appears to be covered in some kind of slick film, and it stands about 4.5 feet tall. But that's not even the strangest part. You see, this thing isn't just standing there. It's balanced on what Henry describes as 3 legs. And when it moves, it doesn't walk or run like any known animal. Instead, it bounds, covering incredible distances with each jump. Henry McDaniel later tells investigators that he did what many of us might do in that situation. He fired his pistol 4 times at point-blank range. He's certain he hit it at least once because the creature makes a horrible hissing sound, like a mixture of a wildcat's screech and a human's scream. Then it turns and bounds away into the darkness, covering an estimated 50 feet in just 3 jumps, before disappearing into the shadows of a nearby railroad embankment. When the police arrive later that night, they find strange tracks in the mud around the McDaniel house. But these aren't like any animal tracks they've ever seen. They're clearly defined prints that look almost like a dog's paw, but with 6 toe pads instead of 4, and they're much larger than any local animal should leave. But here's where things start to get even more interesting. Because what the police don't know yet is that Henry McDaniel wasn't the first person to see something strange in Enfield that spring. And he certainly wouldn't be the last. Now, before we continue with what happened next, we need to back up a few weeks. Because as investigators would later discover, there had been other incidents leading up to Henry McDaniel's encounter, but nobody had connected the dots yet. Earlier that month, a young boy named Greg Garrett had been playing in his backyard just a few blocks from the McDaniel house. Greg was 10 years old at the time, and like many kids his age, he spent a lot of time outdoors. But on this particular afternoon, something happened that would make him never want to play in that yard again. According to Greg, He was playing near an old tire in his backyard when he suddenly felt something grab his shirt from behind. When he turned around, he found himself face to face with a creature that matched what Henry McDaniel would later describe: short arms, strange legs, and those unnerving pink eyes. Greg managed to break free and run inside, but when he tried to tell his parents what had happened, they naturally assumed he was making up stories. After all, what parent wants to believe there's a monster in their backyard? But here's the thing. When Greg's father went outside to prove there was nothing to worry about, he found those same unusual tracks in the dirt. Six-toed prints that didn't match any known animal. But that's not all. In the weeks between Greg's encounter and Henry McDaniel's, there had been several reports of unusual sounds in the area. Farmers reported their livestock acting strangely, becoming agitated for no apparent reason. Dogs throughout the neighborhood would suddenly start barking in the middle of the night, all facing the same direction, as if they sensed something their owners couldn't see. And then there were the tracks. Similar prints had been found in various locations around Enfield, but because they seemed so impossible, most people had dismissed them as some kind of prank. But now, with multiple witnesses reporting similar encounters, people were starting to wonder if there might be something more to these stories. After Henry McDaniel's encounter makes the local news, something unexpected happens. People start coming forward with their own stories. A truck driver reports seeing a strange creature bound across the highway just outside of town. A farmer finds unusual damage to his barn that doesn't match any known animal's behavior. And most intriguingly, an elderly resident recalls stories from her childhood of similar sightings in the area dating back to the 1940s. But what happened next would take this story from a local curiosity to something that would attract attention from across the country. It's May 6, 1973, just 11 days after Henry McDaniel's first encounter. The story has already made the local papers, and a few amateur investigators have started showing up in Enfield, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. Most locals think it's all blown over. After all, whatever it was, it seems to have disappeared. But at around 3 a.m., Henry McDaniel is awakened by that same unmistakable sound he heard before. This time, though, it's not at his door. The noise is coming from the railroad tracks behind his house. Now, most people who'd already had one terrifying encounter with an unknown creature would probably stay inside, maybe call the police and wait for morning. But Henry McDaniel isn't most people. You see, he's been carrying the weight of his previous encounter for days. People have been questioning his story, suggesting maybe he was drunk or confused. Some have even accused him of making the whole thing up for attention. So when he hears that sound again, Henry does something that would change the course of this story forever. He grabs his flashlight and his gun, and he goes outside to investigate. What he sees next would be corroborated by multiple witnesses who happened to be in the area that night. The creature is there on the railroad tracks, but this time, it's not alone. In the beam of his flashlight, Henry can make out not one, but two sets of those piercing pink eyes. But here's where things take an unexpected turn. Because just as Henry is trying to process what he's seeing, a car full of monster hunters who'd been staking out the area drives up, their headlights illuminating the scene. And for the first time, multiple people simultaneously witness what's been terrorizing Enfield. The creatures react to the light and the noise. But instead of running away, they do something that defies explanation. They bound straight up the railroad embankment, covering an impossible distance in just a few leaps. One of the monster hunters later estimates that the creatures cleared at least 75 feet in a single jump. The significance of this encounter cannot be overstated. You see, now it's not just Henry McDaniel's word anymore. There are multiple witnesses, including people from outside the community, who had no connection to the previous sightings. And they all describe the same impossible details: the 3 legs, the short arms, the pink eyes, and most importantly, those incredible leaps. In the days following the second encounter, Enfield becomes something of a circus. Monster hunters and curiosity seekers flood the small town. The local police have to establish patrols to keep people from trespassing on private property at night. News crews from as far away as Chicago show up, hoping to catch a glimpse of what they're now calling the Enfield monster. But here's the strange thing. Despite all this attention, despite all these people looking for it, the creature is never seen again, at least not officially. There are a few scattered reports of strange noises and unusual tracks, but nothing that matches the clarity of those first encounters. The physical evidence from the incidents is analyzed, but the results are inconclusive. The tracks, while clearly unusual, don't match any known animal. And while Henry McDaniel was certain he hit the creature when he shot at it that first night, no blood or other physical evidence was ever found. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this story isn't what was found, it's what wasn't found. You see, in all the investigations that followed, nobody could find any sign of where this creature came from or where it went. No unusual dens or lairs were discovered. No remains were ever found. It's as if this thing just appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as mysteriously. The Enfield monster case remains one of the most well-documented yet unexplained cryptid encounters in American history. What makes it particularly compelling is the credibility of the witnesses. Henry McDaniel never sought publicity for his encounters. In fact, he seemed almost reluctant to talk about them. He was a respected member of his community, known for his honesty, with no history of making outlandish claims. And here's something to think about. While the description of the creature seems impossible by our understanding of biology, all the witnesses described the same impossible details. The 3 legs, the short arms, the pink eyes, the incredible jumping ability. These weren't vague reports of something large moving in the darkness. These were specific, consistent descriptions of something that shouldn't exist. So what was the Enfield monster? Some researchers have suggested it might have been a mutated kangaroo, escaped from a private exotic animal collection. Others propose it could have been a misidentified bear with an injury that forced it to move unusually. But none of these explanations fully account for all the details reported by witnesses. Today, if you visit Enfield, Illinois, you'll find it still much the same as it was in 1973. The cornfields still stretch to the horizon. The railroad tracks still cut through the countryside. And if you talk to the locals, many of them still remember those strange spring nights when something impossible emerged from the darkness. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this story isn't what happened in 1973. It's what it suggests about our world. Because if multiple reliable witnesses can encounter something that defies our understanding of what's possible, something that leaves physical evidence yet evades all explanation, then what else might be out there in the darkness, just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams? And here's one final thing to consider. The last person to see the Enfield monster, one of the monster hunters present during that second encounter, reported something that's often overlooked in retellings of this story. He claimed that just before the creatures bounded away into the darkness, one of them turned and looked directly at the observers. And in that moment, he said he didn't see the mindless stare of an animal. Instead, he saw something that seemed almost intelligent. So the next time you're driving through rural Illinois at night and you see something move in the darkness beyond your headlights, remember the Enfield monster. Remember that sometimes the line between what we think is possible and what actually exists out there in the world might be thinner than we think.